FedRAMP Rev 5 providers who thought 20X was a future problem just received a very clear update, and that is parts of the 20X operating model are becoming mandatory this year. Welcome back to the 38 North Security Podcast. I'm Ingrid Velasquez-Woodley, Senior Director of Revenue Strategy here at 38 North Security. Over the past week, CISA and FedRAMP released three significant updates. First, CISA released Binding Operational Directive 2604, which changes how federal agencies prioritize vulnerability remediation. And then FedRAMP released Notice 0014, which applies that direction to FedRAMP cloud services and accelerates adoption of the new vulnerability detection and response and vulnerability evaluation and reporting rules. On the same day, actually a little bit earlier that day, FedRAMP also released Notice 0013, which makes something broader very clear. Rev 5 is already being reshaped around many of the operating expectations behind FedRAMP 20X. So today we are going to explain how these updates fit together, what has actually changed, what FedRAMP providers need to start doing now. Joining me are Sam Leestma, our VP of Solutions Engineering.
Hey, everyone.
And Spence Whitten, our Principal Consultant.
Hello, Ingrid.
Hello. So, Spence, let's start with the big picture. High level, what does BOD 2604 change?
So, it is a fundamental rethinking of how the federal government needs to approach vulnerability management. And this is a long time coming. We've seen this coming for a long time. And those of us who've worked in federal agencies, it's pretty bad, right? I mean, there's a huge quantity of vulnerabilities that have just piled up over time. And I've worked at a major federal agency that had, I think, almost 5,000 high vulnerabilities in its backlog at one point. And it hasn't gotten better. And in the age of AI, we're seeing all this vulnerability slop now, where people can come up with vulnerabilities quite quickly by running through AI tools. Some of them are exploitable, some of them are not. Exploitability is getting easier with some of the more modern LLMs. So we're not going to patch in time. I mean, there is no way to patch ourselves out of the vulnerability cascade that we're dealing with right now. And so the only option is to prioritize and to do so intelligently based on a couple metrics. And so that's what the BOD does, right? It sets out four specific metrics for prioritizing vulnerabilities. And to CISA's credit, they've made this relatively easy. They're providing a lot of the data that agencies need in order to prioritize vulnerabilities, which is great. And it's just a long time coming. So I'm surprised at the speed. I'm surprised with how rapidly they're introducing this. But I mean, good on them for pushing. That's something that this administration has done a good job with, is pushing the agencies to change quickly. And this is CISA doing that and staying on the forefront of vulnerability management.
Sam, to you, operationally and day-to-day, what does this change for teams that are managing vulnerabilities?
It changes that you really have to do your risk analysis automatically. You can't take these thousands and thousands of vulnerabilities and do research on each one individually. You have to take these vulnerabilities and put context about, where they are, what kind of devices they are, what kind of data is on them, and all that. And then you have to take the vulnerabilities and, to Spence's point, talk about, are they exploitable? Are they known out in the wild? What can happen if you exercise the vulnerabilities? This isn't just like creating a large spreadsheet and saying, I'll do everything within your timeframes. This is saying, okay, I have 45 highs, which one's the highest? And really getting down to the analysis. So it'll change how people patch, because you will be looking at the most impactful vulnerabilities. But the thing that'll change the most is how do you get to that? How do you get to that conclusion of which one is that high?
Spence, what did FedRAMP Notice 0014 change for cloud service providers?
So what that did is it operationalized the BOD guidance, right? So the BOD sets out this, again, it's four categories, right? So the BOD demands that you look at the asset exposure. So is a vulnerable asset publicly exposed? Is it on the known exploited vulnerabilities list, or within the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, or the KEV? Is it are you able to automate exploitation, which is an interesting one, which we can talk about a little bit more, and then the technical impact of that vulnerability. So does an adversary gain partial control or total control of a vulnerable asset after exploitation, right? So those are the four things the BOD wants you to take care of. So FedRAMP in its own world has been establishing and working on a version of this, right? So the vulnerability detection and response requirements in FedRAMP 20X, there's a very overlapped Venn diagram between what VDR wanted and what the bot is asking for. And so what 14 does is it essentially normalizes the two. It takes 20X and it shows how 20X guidance maps to the BOD, and it adds a few extra requirements, two in particular, to address what the bot is asking for. So it's an attempt to normalize between what CISA is doing and what FedRAMP's doing. And again, it's really cool. So one of the things that FedRAMP, again, there's people who hate 20X, there's people who love it. Sam has dragged me from one column into the other. So good job, Sam, over the last couple months. I am a fan of the 20X model, but really what I'm a fan of is how fast the government's been able to move. And so I think previously, if this had happened 3 or 4 years ago, this BOD would have come out and the FedRAMP PMO kind of would have sat on it and discussed it for a couple months. And eventually they would have come up with their own guidance that wasn't totally normalized. This in the span of this month, right? CISA comes out with its thing, FedRAMP comes up with its effort normalizing and comparing it and making sure the government's operating in lockstep. And that's just really great execution on the government's part. And it makes our life easier, because in the old days, we would sit there and we would weigh conflicting guidance between here's what DHS is saying, and here's what Department of War is saying, and here is what FedRAMP's saying, and here's what the agencies are saying. And they just seem to be working in lockstep, and this is great. And so that's really what 14 does, is it normalizes between the BOD and what is in the DHS is a new guidance in the BOD.
Excellent. Sam, so FedRAMP is saying that monthly vulnerability scanning is insufficient. Do you agree with this? Why or why not?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with that. So, part of what I did when I was at FedRAMP is I was managing the Conmon team. And so you would get these incredibly large scans, especially from some of our hyperscalers, and you would run them all in. You would take their original risk rating, and then you would create a tracking mechanism that held them to an SLA, right? I think it was 30 for high, 90 for moderate, 120 for low, and you would keep tracking them. If they went out, they would ask for extensions, or they would change the impact of the vulnerability by submitting a request for lowering the risk rating, and you would send that over, and they would look at your different reasons, and they would sign off on it, and then it would change the SLA, but it didn't change the vulnerability, didn't add any protections. It just kind of talked about that context that I had mentioned in my previous answer, right? Monthly scans at the pace at which vulnerabilities are being found and exploited is not acceptable. Like, it's just not going to work. Like, people are going to see massive execution of vulnerabilities on their systems if they don't patch these things, like the bot is saying, and what ultimately VDR is supposed to do, right? I think the cadence of VDR is every 3 days, and that's aggressive, but quite frankly, with AI out there and the ability to automate attacks, and realizing that, attackers don't care about success rates. They're getting bulk. They're sending everything out there. So if you have something sitting out on the edge of your network that is exploitable, right? That even if it's not a huge thing that can happen afterwards. There are chain attacks. There are all sorts of ways that vulnerabilities can build on each other. If you're not looking at that and prioritizing whatever's coming up in those couple of days, you're going to be left patching the wrong thing. So once a month is not a thing anymore. It's not anything that will be effective. And I mean, frankly, I think FedRAMP has caught up to what most organizations are doing, which is not looking at a monthly cycle, right? Like, they weren't doing that. And I think that's part of the reason why you saw in the notification, they're getting very aggressive with implementation timelines, right? They're saying by the end of the year, Rev 5 people need to be doing this, which is a super aggressive timeline. And so I think a lot of those organizations will struggle with every single aspect, but they've probably already done something similar to this. The once a month scan submission and analysis by PMO was a compliance exercise. That was not a security exercise. That was not a risk exercise. It was merely reporting that these are what we found, and we'll give you the information as you ask for it. The real remediation of vulnerabilities needs to be supported by this automated risk analysis, this prioritization, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's been wild. So like when we started in this, for Sam and I both, organizations used to just scan quarterly, right? And they used to whine and scream about having to scan quarterly. And that was back in the day when we weren't, when we were much more resource constrained, and scanning was hard. Like scanning, you used to have to shut down systems to scan, it used to take a lot of resources. Now, I think starting about 10 years ago, when we started doing FedRAMP engagements, we would tell people in the cloud service community that, look, you only have to scan monthly. And they'd be like, what? We scan every 4 hours. We scan every 2 hours. We scan continuously. So this is not, the scanning frequency isn't going to be a big deal for the community. It is going to force a rethinking of vulnerability analysis. And so this is one area where, like I said in the beginning of the podcast, you're not going to patch your way out of this. So we're getting to the point where vulnerabilities are coming out for which there isn't going to be a patch for a while. And so this approach to vulnerability management at least forces you to understand severity so that you can take compensating action. And I think that's somewhere, that is a difference between the way I read the BOD versus the way FedRAMP 20X does. I think FedRAMP 20X, the FedRAMP program, I think they understand this reality where patching isn't necessarily going to be the answer, because there might not be patches out there in the future for really, really fast moving vulnerabilities. And you have to have the ability to respond to unpatchable systems quite quickly. So one way to do that is by making sure things aren't publicly accessible and there are countermeasures in place. Another way to do that for your publicly accessible assets is there's a variety of different techniques you can play when you have a vulnerable asset that's public facing, but you have to know that, right? And so both the BOD and FedRAMP 20X do ask that you go through and evaluate whether or not something is, in the BOD's language, publicly accessible, in 20X's language, internet reachable, which are different, right? And so I do want to emphasize that for our FedRAMP 20X people who are looking at 20X. The BOD is, relative to 20X, a minimum standard. So 20X does do some things that are more intensive than the BOD. And a big one I want to talk about, because it gets to Sam's point about automation, you're not going to be able to do this manually. So on the 20X side, 20X wants you to evaluate the exploitability of vulnerabilities. So that's part of VDR in 20X. In the BOD, they're really just looking at whether or not exploitability can be automated. And they're supposedly going to be reporting that, which will be interesting. I haven't dug into that data yet. I haven't really dug into the color on that to see how they're evaluating it and whether or not I think it's airtight. But 20X kind of doesn't care. 20X is less concerned about automated, whether or not it's automatable. In fact, 14 specifically states you're to assume that exploit is automated unless you can validate otherwise. What they care about is whether or not it's exploitable at all, which is a much more interesting question.
Spence, I'm so glad you mentioned publicly exposed assets and internet reachable components. Can you go a little deeper into what the differences are between those two?
Sure. So a publicly exposed asset is anything that sits there and has direct access to the internet, right? So that could be a VPN. You know how I love VPNs. Just kidding. For those who don't know me, I detest enterprise VPNs. But an enterprise VPN is like a classic internet reachable asset, right? In a lot of architectures, anybody on the internet can talk to this device. Bastion hosts are another example. Web portals, particularly web front ends, can be another example. But you can go a layer beyond that. So I think 20X wants to differentiate between, yeah, fine, you have perimeter things that directly take the blow of the internet, right? But you have some other assets that, even if they aren't directly talking to the internet, are still reachable from the internet just by bypassing one or two assets. So like a microservice that does processing for a web application. So you have a web application sitting here, maybe you've gone through a WAF, fine, that's what really sees the internet. Then you have a web portal that you sign into that kind of sees the internet, a filtered version of the internet through the WAF. Then maybe you go through a firewall behind that to a cluster of containers that actually process things. Well, that cluster of containers that processes things is still internet reachable. I can send a packet that goes through the WAF, through the web portal, through the firewall into that cluster of containers for processing. And if I'm a really sophisticated attacker, I can do some really interesting manipulation of that backend cluster via all those different nodes, right? And so that's what I think 20X understands about the cloud in particular, is that just because you aren't immediately on the network edge, you still talk to the internet, even if it's through these different intermediaries, and attackers can still interact with those resources. And so I think 20X is quite correct in drawing that distinction, but it is it's quite a big distinction that is going to impact our clients.
Sam, this is for you. NTC 0014 specifically mentioned mitigation versus remediation. Why does this distinction matter enough to mention? What is it trying to say?
Yeah, well, I think it's to Spence's point, because you might have stuff that doesn't have patches yet, or for some reason you can't get the patch on there in the timely manner. You have to be able to mitigate it, which means you're reducing the risk to a negligible place, or as negligible as you possibly can. So if you don't have a patch and you still have functionality that needs to happen, or it's not quite as severe, so you don't take it offline, you want to reduce the blast radius of the exploitation of the vulnerability. And sometimes that can't be isolation, that can be extra filtering on the end, it could be limiting source IPs. There's all sorts of things you can do to mitigate down, but if there is no patch, you cannot remediate it. It's not remediatable at this point in time. And so when you have this kind of velocity and the amount of findings that are coming through and how quickly attacks are happening and how many are not going to have patches, you're going to have a mitigation strategy for especially your edge devices, your internet reachable, your internet accessible, in either of the documents. Like, you're going to have to be able to respond to that, and that's the strong differentiation between the two, and that's a result of the environment we're in. Like, attacks are more frequent, there are more persistent attacks, there are new vulnerabilities, whether exploited or not, that are being found like every day, and there's not enough time for companies to have patches available at the rate they're being discovered.
And I think this is one of the most exciting. It's one of the most exciting areas in tech right now in cybersecurity. So back in the day when I first started my career, I was working on a bunch of research projects with Department of Homeland Security, Science and Technology, and DARPA, right? And every year they would publish research priorities. And one of the research priorities every year were self-healing networks or automated response to attacks, right? And there have been vendors over the years that have spun up trying to do that. They've funded research to try to do that. And it just hasn't been possible. And I think it hasn't been possible partly because we didn't have, and AI wasn't up to the challenge 10 years ago for doing this. We might be there. We might just be on the cusp of that. And I keep seeing online people talking about how patch cycles are going to have to get faster. We're going to have to patch faster. We're going to have to manage vulnerabilities internally faster. And it's like, yeah, I mean, we're going to have to do that, but like, that's not going to solve the problem. So without self-healing networks, without things that can auto mitigate instead of remediate, so auto mitigate, I don't think we're going to stay on top. And so I would love to see some cool research activity. I'd love to see some cool investment. We're working on products internally that have auto mitigation as an option. I mean, that's something that's kind of in our roadmap long term. So we're curious about this, but it is what's essential. So we are not going to, for your question for Sam, you're not going to remediate your way out of the pit. Like, that is the base requirement now. Quick remediation of known vulnerabilities with patches, like, that has to happen. That's just table stakes. It's this next step for auto mitigation that's really critical.
Great. So I do have a few more questions about some more specific things, but let's step back a little bit. And Spence, let me ask you really quickly and high level, what is the main takeaway for NTC 0013?
So 1.3 is cool. 1.3, I mean, first, the big one is that Rev 5 is going away. And so I think a lot of people have been dragging their heels on that. They've been thinking that in the civilian world, DOW is a different story, but in the civilian world, we're going to hang on to Rev 5. That is not going to happen, right? So Rev 5 is going away, and it's going away on a tight timeline. Before, Sam and I joked about this, right? So in the old days, you could take a government timeline and you could just assume that was going to slip to the right and that was going to slip to the right again. CMMC is a great example of right. Like, CMMC has been part of my life almost my entire career, and it has slipped constantly. FedRAMP, these guys don't slip, right? So ever since they've pushed 20X, they hit their deadlines. And so I think that's the number one big takeaway is that FedRAMP Rev 5 is going away. There are also some major changes to how FedRAMP thinks about rules and parameters. And I think this is, I guess, part of me is a little sad because I thought some of those rules and parameters were smart in the cloud space, but I understand what they're trying to do, right? So they have kind of realized that the hard-coded parameters in FedRAMP have, particularly in Rev 5, and some of the hard-coded rules that have created some confusion over the years have fallen behind commercial practice. Like, commercial practice has gotten ahead of some of these parameters and these rules. And yet when people stand up dedicated commercial environments, dedicated federal environments in their commercial environments, they sort of automatically downgrade to meet FedRAMP's rules rather than maintaining their commercial standards. And this has been something that FedRAMP's been really adamant about. They've been very specific. In fact, 13 explicitly states that they do not want providers standing up dedicated federal spaces that diverge from their commercial environments. They just don't want it. We can talk about why there's some reasons that people are still doing it even despite that. But they want commercial cloud environments in the federal government. And so this step helps get there by not creating these split rules between commercial and federal. And I've been in plenty of silly situations where I was arguing with auditors where we had a more stringent standard in place, but the auditor would be like, no, the parameter is X. And that's like, well, we're doing double X. And they're like, it doesn't matter. You fail. You're not doing X. And so that's been a little bit better as years have gone on, but this was a common thing in like 2014, 2015, arguing with auditors. So we have dumbed down federal security to align to FedRAMP requirements over the years. And that is changing. And then I think the other big thing is they have finally published some clear guidance. And actually we can talk about why maybe it's not quite so clear, but still it's nice to have some guidance on what a documentation package in 20X should look like. So nobody can honestly tell you that they know what documentation is required for 20X. There's plenty of people on LinkedIn who say they have the answer. They don't have the answer because frankly, I don't quite think that FedRAMP has the answer. I think they're still noodling over what documentation actually has to be required. But like I just had a meeting with one of our major clients and a government agency where we were all kind of like, look, these are the documents we're producing for compliance, but we don't really know if it's required. And the agency was like, yeah, we don't really know what's required either. This actually gives us a step in the right direction because it gives us some nice organized little pile of things that we can start shooting for. I do want to talk about some of the lingering confusion that exists in there, but I'm confident that it'll get cleaned up. And hey, knowing FedRAMP 20X, they're going to clean it up really fast because that's what those folks do.
Yes, so far we're seeing how fast they're moving and how organized actually. So really interesting that you bring up packages. Sam, this is for you. Part of what 1.3 introduced is the SDR, or the Security Decision Record. What is that and how is it different from VDR?
Well, I mean, the system decision record is just, talking about how your stuff is implemented, right? This is not a rote SSP that has a control statement. You talk about how each individual control is implemented. It talks about general concepts that meet the KSIs and the other standards inside of 20X, right? So this is not a 300-pound document that no one's going to read. This is a description so your customers understand what you're trying to show them, right? We're exposing very technical data to people now as the proof of your security. So understanding, what you're doing, how you're looking at things, how you're comparing it is something that they're going to need. And that's really a lot of what the SDR is. It's talking about the philosophies around it. I mean, to Spence's point, there's no other real documentation requirements around it. There's implications based off of that SDR and some of the other processes. But this is really where you're telling that overall story about how you came to your security decisions, how you met them, how you might have some that you left out because you didn't want them in there because they didn't meet your business case or your data case or any number of other things. It's really how you communicate your risk philosophy, your security philosophy over to your customers.
And one thing I want to add on the security decision record is that there's a subtle philosophical change that's happening here, and I don't know that I like it. And so it is going to be interesting to talk about. So before, the way actually every compliance standard in the world works is you write what you do, right? You write what this is what we do. And then an auditor comes in, reads what you do, and then evaluates, A, are you actually doing what you say you are doing? And B, does that actually meet the requirements of the control? So the way the security decision record is written right now is that it is including in your descriptions of how you meet a rule. So from our FedRAMP 20X we're kind of emerging and we have rules and we have KSIs and you kind of got to do both, right? And so when just talking about a rule, you have to describe not only what you're doing, you also have to show how that's independently validated and verified. And so that's a little bit odd. And so what we usually are used to in compliance where evidence is provided as part of the assessment process and an independent assessor validates that evidence, right? I don't know how to marry that, because this is a mashup now of those two things, where it's like, not only do I need to write what I'm doing, I need to talk about how I'm proving that, and I need to demonstrate how that is proven. And that's written into how they want you to approach the individual write-ups of the rules. And that's hard. Like, that's a tremendous amount of work. And I don't know that 20X wanted to add that level of documentation. I don't think they intended that to be that level of documentation complexity. And it would be nice to break that back out again to kind of the older model where, we can focus our write-ups in the security decision record around what we're doing and why this is justified, and let the independent assessor, which still has a role in 20X, do that part. And right now it's confused. And I actually, truthfully, am not quite sure how, particularly for our clients where we will write up compliance for systems that aren't really fully operational. Like, a lot of times we're building documentation and security at the same time they're building the system. I'm not quite sure how to comply with this. And so it is one thing that I don't love about the security decision record as set up. But regardless, my opinion doesn't really matter to 20X. So it is something that our clients need to be aware of, is that this is a major philosophical change to how we approach managing compliance on a day-to-day basis.
I would say, Spence, I think that's interesting. To me is that, as long as you produce a standard of how things are looked at, it will change how you build things to meet that standard. So there is part of me that does like the CSP to have some power in how they're measured against, the standard. If you give an auditor a set of rules and say, look at these rules, that build will often go to those rules instead of what makes best sense in the system overall, right? So, when you're validating something that is a little bit more complex than do you have 3 strikes and you're out, having an auditor being able to be versed in every single technology, architecture, and all that to write an effective validation of that sometimes did cause those, square peg in a round hole type of situations. And so I don't think it's perfect, but I think there has to be some room where the understanding of how the system works as a whole is taken into account when you validate, not just a simple check that is used in a spreadsheet historically, where you'd say yes, they're good, no, they're bad, and to that thing you talked about earlier, and I'm actually better, but no, you didn't meet my little checkbox. I think that's part of what it's trying to solve. It might not be elegant yet, but I think it's the evolution. And to your point, we'll see as they go, and they'll take feedback, and we've seen this. They'll take feedback and they'll try to make things better, right?
And
so
I guess what bothers me about it is that so it's this piece, right? So explanation of how the rule is followed, or an explanation for that's great, right? Simple, I get it. It's so much better than the way we've tackled control implementation statements. Verification that the implementation is appropriate for the rule. Hey, cool. Like, I get that. Like, that's great. It's this part that I struggle with. So the validation that the implementation is in place and working as intended. And so I think one of the things that 20X is trying to get away from is the old school compliance model where an assessment is coming and we generate hundreds, even thousands of pieces of evidence, and it's this huge manual process to go do, and we turn that evidence over and it's point in time, right? To me, this reads on a complete betrayal of that priority, right? Because this is now the only way to validate that an implementation in places for a rule is to go chase pieces of evidence. And what am I supposed to do? Provide screenshots for what that evidence is in my security decision record to verify that rule is in place? Like, that is, I guess I'm not handing it over to an auditor, but like, this is back to the old model that I kind of thought we were getting away from with 20X. And I don't know that it adds that much value when the next bullet points in the list are independent verification, independent validation. Like, let the 3POs do their job and get that, but like, pulling the evidence to include in my official record, like, I've gone back to the old school model, like ISO, SOC 2 style, old FedRAMP style, where I'm like taking screenshots and throwing it in place to validate that something's in place. And I don't like that. That does seem to be a betrayal of what we were trying to get at with 20X. And I'm hoping this does change.
I think the problem that they're trying to solve is always kind of this natural distrust between all parties, right? And I think that's what drove a lot of this, right? Are the CSPs hiding anything? Conversations I would hear back in the day, right? I think there's a way to look at that. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. You say, okay, my validation, this thing you're looking for is not answered somewhere else. So like an example I would think of is all of my account management happens in this one place. And you write all the rules, you show you phase in there, and then you say for validation, here are all the other places where accounts could be managed. Here's a validation that says there's nowhere else, so my rule is applied properly. And so that's that's one of the, just off the top of my head, of ways to think about it. But I think, to your point, I'm not sure that's the intention, right? I'm not sure which one of our thoughts on this is the intention. And we'll see as we, kind of bring this out in the wild and see some of these packages. All the validations and verifications that have happened thus far have been in the pilot program, and not everybody had all their KSIs in place. We need fully mature systems to go through this and see what the feedback is in order to really get to that intent, or they need to put some more descriptors of what they're actually looking for.
I do have one last question for each of you guys to wrap us up today. Spence, FedRAMP says it's going to stop accepting Rev 5 applications in 2027. If I were a provider deciding between Rev 5 and 20X right now, what would our discussion look like?
So if you're a legacy provider and you're not containerized and you're not set up to do just-in-time access, which is a 20X requirement, and you manage your environment old school style, getting into production, messing around with stuff, doing a very manual process, which is still a lot of cloud services serving the federal government, 20X is not for you. Rush and get in under the Rev 5 window so you have a little bit of time to figure out your automation strategy. Like, that is a big lift. Like, 20X is not for old school, non-modernized organizations. If you are on the other hand, if you are a highly automated provider and you figured out a lot of that stuff and you're running your cloud-based with modern best practices, infrastructure as code, just-in-time access, et cetera, 20X is a no-brainer, right? Like, for organizations that have done that hard, heavy lift, which is hard, right? But organizations who figured that out, 20X is great. It is, and again, I think it's great, even with all these unknowns as to how heinous the documentation side is going to be. It is still a better model for compliance. It's a better model for government compliance. It is more visible. It is easier for the government. I mean, I was on a call with a major agency the other day, and they were like, all right, so how hard is it going to be for us to sponsor this 20X package? I was like, you don't have to. I was like, oh, okay, great. Well, what do I have to do? It's like, well, you got to log into the trust center and you got to look at the data we're providing. And they're like, that's it? Like, this is amazing, right? Like, so for agencies, it's so much easier too. And they're really on board once you show them what this looks like in practice. So to me, 20X is a no-brainer if you're a modern cloud.
It's so interesting that you say that, because at this event that we were at yesterday, and I had this conversation, right, with somebody from Vanta and with other GRC providers as well, that there's actually a pretty clear distinction between which providers like 20X and which do not. Like, there's a very clear, demographic difference. It's so interesting. Sam, last question for you. If I have a Rev 5 ATO right now and I am hearing all of this for the first time, what should I be doing in the next 60 or 90 days?
First and foremost, I think the implementing VDR is what you have to do now, because that's the thing. Like, if you don't have the automation around your vulnerability management, that is a deadline at the end of this year, right? And then you get 3 months grace, and then they kind of said, we're not telling you what we're going to do yet, but they're going to do something. We'll see. You're at least going to be on a cap, and how that cap affects your certification, it will be interesting. But I think after that, I think it's the same advice that Spence gave about, Rev 5 or 20X. If you're not automating yet, you need to get on your automation plan. You need to think about that stuff, because it's going to expire. They're going to stop processing Rev 5 certifications. Now, there's always this path that you can talk about is that an agency can grant an ATO on a Rev 5 package after that date. But you won't be FedRAMP certified. You won't be able to port it to other places. You won't be recognized in the FedRAMP program at all, right? And so if you ever plan to play past 27 in the entire market, 29 in the entire market, you need to get ready to be able to be 20X. You need that automation in place. You need the modern architecture. You need all of those things that allow 20X to do its magic, right? And to get this continuous reporting. If you don't have that, and you want to still have a a suite of federal clients. I think managing 10 individual ATOs at individual agencies without a FedRAMP certification is going to become extremely burdensome. And I think there's internal political pressure too to make sure that people are not deviating from the standard. And FedRAMP is the standard for cloud systems in the government. And so I think get on your automation, get your stuff in order. But the next 6 months is VDR. You got to figure that out now, because that's going to be a thing. And then you got to really plan of, do I want to stay in the space? And if I do, I better get on some modern architecture, get some automation in place, and make sure that I'm ready to look at, to support continuous validation. It's what's going to happen.
All right, so to put a bow on today's discussion, BOD 2604 changes how the federal government prioritizes vulnerabilities. 1.4 turns that direction into an accelerated operational requirement for every FedRAMP certified cloud service. And 1.3 makes clear that Rev 5 itself is already moving toward the responsibility, flexibility, automation, and continuous assurance model associated with FedRAMP 20X. For providers, take note that the first major deadline is December 7th, 2026, but the work required to meet it, like Sam and Spence have been saying, starts way, way before then. So Sam and Spence, thank you both for joining me today.
Thanks, Ingrid.
Thanks, Ingrid.